Morning, everyone. We're going to get started. It's week 5. Thanks for showing up on time. So everybody should have their lab mark. If you submitted lab 1, I wanted to make sure I got your marks back to you. So everybody should have those. By the way, if anybody notices when we take a break that I forget to stop my stream or start it, I actually forgot yesterday in my class forgot to stream the first hour of class. So I'm a little foggy this morning, so I may need reminders. Hey, Rich, press start and press stop and press start. We also have a visitor in class today. I'd like to welcome Professor Shweta Sharma. She's here from our partner college, CIIS in India. So Shweta was one of the professors for our new students from CIIS who've joined us here in second year, and she's here in Barrie this week, visiting some of the different web classes just to see what life is like here at Georgian. So today, what we are going to do, we're going to do a few things. I want to do a quick review of Lab 1, quickly go over that. By and large, those were, for the most part, well done. A couple of slight changes to our schedule. Originally on the syllabus, I'm going to give out assignment 1 in a bit. Obviously, lots of students are going to show up late, and rather than me explaining the assignment twice, I'll just explain it a little later in the class so I don't have to repeat myself. Originally, the date for assignment 1, the due date was next Monday night. That's the end of Thanksgiving weekend, which is a terrible time to make an assignment due. So I'm going to move the assignment. It won't be due until next Wednesday night. Okay, so you don't have to spend Monday of Thanksgiving long weekend finishing the assignment. Okay, and I don't have to spend Monday of the long weekend answering all of your panicked emails about stuff that's not working. Okay, so I'll give you a couple extra days. So there's nothing due for marks this week, but you'll need to start on assignment 1, and you probably want to start now because I have office hours over the next 3 days, so you can get help before the long weekend if you need it. Okay, then you have until next Wednesday night. Next week at the end of class, I'm going to give you lab 2, and rather than making that due Wednesday night, you'll have until the Friday. Okay, so you'll have 2 things due next week. Assignment 1 due Wednesday night, and that's a pretty big assignment. It's worth 20% of your grade, and then a second lab, which will be due Friday night. Okay, so we'll do that, but you get time that if you want to choose to take most of the long weekend off, I'm giving you that option, and you'll still have time to get your stuff done. So as I said, we'll go over lesson 1 in a little bit. I also want to make sure this announcement was primarily for our new students from CIIS. And again, most of them are not here for me to reiterate this, but I sent this out last night. Please make sure you have all these things active, that you have a GitHub account, that you've installed both Git and the desktop client on your machine. Okay. You also need a Windows Live ID, not a Georgian version. So you need to have either an Outlook, a Hotmail, or a live.com address. Now, for those of you who were here last semester, I noticed several of you managed to post Lab 1 to Azure, so I assume your Azure accounts still work. If you set them up in Tom's class last semester, you still have access to those. So we're going to be using those moving forward. I'm going to want your assignments published and posted to Azure, and we'll look today at how to do that. Okay. The easiest way is by pushing them to GitHub and then connecting your Azure website to GitHub. Obviously, for our students who are new from CIIS, getting your Azure account set up is something we may have time to do today at the end of class, if we can. Today, I want to talk about 2 things. I'm going to do the Lab 1 solution in a minute. And then we've got 2 topics for today: input validation and exception handling. We're going to look at what stuff can go wrong in our .NET applications, how do we try to prevent getting bad data from users, and what are some of the error handling tools that we have with ASP.NET to handle things like 404s and other errors and other problems, right? How do we prevent our applications from crashing and giving us what's known as the yellow screen of death in the Microsoft world? So just before I do that, I want to just run through a solution for Lab 1, show you what it looked like. So here was my version, looked something like this. And a couple of things to note. For the password box, the characters are supposed to be hidden, so we can't see the user's password. And notice the address box is a multi-line box. And then I should be able to pick one of these. A few people forgot to put this checkbox on here. Box list. And lastly, our drop down. And when I submitted the form, it just printed out all the values on the screen. This is all I was looking for your lab to do. In terms of designing the user interface, most people did fine here. There were a couple of little tricks, one to get the password and one to get this to render as a text area so we could enter multiple lines of text. So if we just peek at the HTML, on our password box, we still used an ASP text box, but we just had to add this attribute, text mode equals password. And that hides the characters as we're typing. So at runtime in the browser, it will show up as an input type equals password. So when we use an ASP text box, we add text mode equals password, it gets rendered as a regular HTML password input. And for our text area, we still use a regular ASP text box. There's no such thing as an ASP text area tag. We just add this attribute instead, text mode equals multi-line. And that'll generate the input rather than a single line, it'll give us a multi-line box. So again, if we view the source, that element does get rendered as a regular HTML text area at the end of the day. So in terms of my outputs, here's all my form inputs at the top, and down at the bottom, I had a whole series of labels. So for every input, I had a matching label. I saw many solutions, and this is of concern to me, and if you do this in your assignment, you're going to lose marks. Many solutions where people called their inputs text box 1, text box 2, label 1, label 2. Not acceptable in a professional application, okay? You must give all of your controls descriptive IDs that explain to other people what those IDs are. Okay, I don't want to see text box 1, text box 2. They need to have descriptions. So I had an input called txt name, where the user would type in their name. I had an output down below called LBL name, so those values match. Same for password, same for address. Okay, so we need to use descriptive names for all of our objects that we create in our applications. So in my code, when the user clicked the button, I would just take the text value of each input and write it into the label with the same name. So name would show in this label, password would show in the password label, etc. To get the radio button list, we just use the selected value property. We used that in class last week. That will tell us which item in a drop-down list or radio button list was picked. Now this section was for bonus marks because we didn't have a chance to do it, but we'll quickly walk through it. In interpreting our radio button list choice or our drop-down, we would just use this property that we used last week in class, the selected value. There's many choices, but the selected value, there's only going to be one choice. The user can't pick multiple things at the same time. They can only pick one. Our checkbox list is a little different though, because we've got 5 options and the user can check any combination. So a selected value property, that doesn't help us because we have many selected values. So how do we know whether the user has checked off, for example, HTML, PHP, and C#, but not this box and not this box? So what we do is a similar kind of loop as we use in PHP, we use a for each loop. So we are looping through each of the items in our checkbox list. And then one item at a time, we check, is that item selected, yes or no? And if that item is selected, we add it on to the list of skills. So if I run this with my debugger just so we can see what happens. So if I have HTML, PHP, and CSS checked, here's how the logic actually works. So our first item is HTML, and it tells us that that value was selected. So this if statement's going to evaluate to true. So our skills label says skills, and we add HTML onto the label. We're appending on because I checked HTML. And we go back to the next item, which says PHP. That one I also checked. But once again, now we're going to add PHP onto the end of that list. My next item says CSS. I didn't check that one, so my debugger shows selected's false. So this line gets skipped. And notice my skills list, it still just says HTML and PHP. Now I'm back to my fourth item, which is C#. I did check C#. So my code will go into here again. I've added C# to my list, which now says HTML, PHP, CSS. And then it checks the final item in the checkbox, which is Java. I didn't check that one. Selected shows as false. So it skips right over that line. So that's my final output on my label, are the three that are checked. And then it does my province, and I'm done. So when I check HTML, PHP, and C#, my skills list shows as HTML, PHP, and C# down at the bottom. So we can't check one value. We have to check every checkbox individually. Is this checked yes or no? So that's how we would be interpreting a checkbox list. Are there any questions about Lab 1?
Can I see the default?
Sure. Which part did you want to see?
That checkbox.
Sure. So inside of our checkbox object, checkbox list object, there is a collection of ASP list item objects. It's like a child parent. So because the user can pick as many of these as they want, we need to loop through that list and check each one at a time. Is this one checked? Is this one checked? Is this one checked? Is this one checked? Now we still use the ASP list items in the drop-down list, but the drop-down list only allows the user to make one selection to check every individual item to see if it's been checked. Only in a checkbox list, because this allows multiple selections simultaneously. Does that help, Margot?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So let's open up for a minute. I'm going to show you. I showed you one way the other day how to copy files from one project into another. What I'm going to show you today, what we want to do is take our project from last week, but we want to add on to it. But rather than making changes to our week 4 solution, I want to make a week 5 solution, but use the week 4 project as a template. So then when we create week 5, we can pick our week 4 project, and Visual Studio will automatically make a duplicate of the project for us. So in Visual Studio, if you can open up the project we did in class last week, or your version. If you don't have it, you can get mine from GitHub. So I'm going to open up my week 4 solution dated September 27th. So I'm going to leave this version alone. I'm not going to change this. What I want to do is create a template from my week 4 project. So I can do that by clicking File, and there's an option here that says in the file menu, about halfway down, it says export template. So it's right on the file menu as soon as my project is opened. I'll click export template. I want this as a project template. So when I create a new project, I can create it based on this, and everything that's in this one will get added to my new project. So just click the next button. And it shows me here's where it will be exported to my Visual Studio folder, a folder called My Exported Templates week4.zip. I'll just click finish. So I didn't change any of the options. So now inside of this folder, I have a week 4 template as a zip file. So just click File, Export Template, Next, and Finish. That's it. And this, you should get this. Now I don't need this solution anymore, so I can click File and Close Solution. And now I think we want to pick this option. We're going to try this one. If it doesn't work, we'll recreate it. Let me just see if this is the right object. No, actually, sorry. We'll try this. File, New Project. Don't choose New Website. We're always picking New Project. And I'll pick Visual C#. Where's my template? Just click on Visual C#. Don't click Web. We just click Visual C# and I scroll down to the bottom. Now one of my templates says week 4. So this was the template we just created a minute ago. So I'll do that one more time. Click File, New Project, click Visual C#, and here's the project for last week. I'm going to check off Create New Git Repository. I'm going to call this project week 5, and I'll save it in my COMP2084 folder. So here's my folder last week. I'm going to save it in here as well. So this will create a week 5 folder and build a new project and copy all the work we did last week into that. Click OK. So now I have an actual duplicate. So here's week 4 from last week. Everything's dated last week. And here's the week 5 project we just created. But rather than creating an empty project, we're working with all the stuff we did last week. So we'll do this most weeks. We'll stop with this one today. We probably won't use this one next week. We'll make a new application next week. And then the next few classes, we're going to keep exporting and building on more features into that same project for a while. So now I have a week 5 solution, and I should just be able to start it up without debugging. I haven't done anything. It'll just compile the project and hopefully launch in my browser. So this is exactly how we left it and what I put up on GitHub at the end of class last week. So there was our hello page. Here was our tip page. And this was our list page we never quite got to. So this is exactly how we left our code. If you don't have the complete version, then mine is on GitHub for you. So we probably want to change this. We want to change our master page and our home page. Sorry, our master, so that they say week 5. So I'll open up my site.master. And in here on my line 30, it says COMP2084 week 4. I'll just change that to week 5. And where else does it say week 5? And on our home page, on default, it also says week 4, so we can change the text on our default page. So I'll open up default. I'll save those changes to my master page and default, so now they say week 5. So our week 4 solution is unchanged. It's its own set of files. We're not working with those same files anymore. So what we want to do with this page, this site, is we want to add some input validation, right? This site's pretty easy to crash. So right now I can do this, right? I can do that. There's our yellow error screen of death. We're going to look later how we prevent this and do custom error handling with ASP.NET. Or I could do something like this as well. So those are some of the validations we'll typically check for, right? We want to require fields. Now, can we add HTML5 attributes to these for validation? Yes, we can. If we wanted to add required on, we could. We can check for numeric values. What other types of input validations might we have to add to a typical web application besides required fields and numeric checks? All right.
Make sure it's not injecting JavaScript.
Okay. Yeah, we may be checking for script tags. What other kinds of things might we want to check? Yeah. So give me an example. What would be an example of a validation we might want to do? Okay. Yep. So we want to make sure we use a number. Is that? Sorry?
Negative value?
Yeah, maybe we want to make sure that value, not only it's a number, but it's within a certain range, right? It's 0 or higher. What other kinds of validations? If we were going to build a registration form, what kinds of things on a registration page would we want to validate? And let's go here for a minute. What other validation rules might be used here in addition to the ones we've already talked about? Devin?
Phone numbers, emails.
Yep, so formats, right? It's not going to allow me to put in, I'm going to like that format. It's got to be either a phone number or email. What's it checking here? Right? I put in phone numbers. Yeah, we might be checking that 2 values match. And in fact, it's strange that they don't actually have 2 password fields. Typically on a registration, we're going to have 2 passwords and we need to make sure the user enters the same password twice. How's that for my birthday?
It Shouldn't be less than time.
Right. It's a valid date. Like that date does exist, but it makes no sense as a valid date on this page, right? You know, if it was an expiry date, well, then that date should be acceptable. But based on the context, my birth date obviously can't be in the future. So all of these kinds of things need to be validated. We get junk input from our users, which is going to break things and mess up our applications. So all kinds of things we need to be checking. Doing validation in ASP.NET is super easy, okay? Because they've given us controls that we can literally drag and drop onto our forms where we can easily check these kinds of things. And we don't actually have to write any code at all. We just have to put in some HTML tags and it will automatically do that. Okay. So, the first thing we want to do, so let's go back to our hello page. Now we could add, if I add the HTML5 required attribute, this will work if I save that change. Now Visual Studio says, you know, I need required equals true here, but it should still work. If I go back, load my hello page now, the HTML5 validator does work because I'm on an HTML5 compliant device. However, instead of using the HTML5 validator for now, we're going to look at some of the ASP.NET validation tools. So if you click on View, and down near the bottom, open this toolbox. These are all of the standard ASP.NET controls. We're not going to use those. I'm just going to click up here where it says standard. I'm going to close that list. And 2 sections down, there's a subheading that says validation. So underneath data, before navigation, I'm going to open up validation. So here are some different validation tools that come with ASP.NET. And these were around long before HTML5 ever existed. Back in the dark ages when many of you were still in elementary school. So they have this neat tool called a required field validator. So let's drag one, let's click on required field validator. And I'm going to put it over here after my ASP text box. Just close that up. So we can look at what we get. It generates a required field validator tag. It gives it an ID with run at equals server because it's an ASP server control. It has an error message. Now we can change that because right now what that error message is going to say is required field validator, which is a pretty lousy message to give to our users. So let's change this error message to just say required. I'm just changing. So all the code that got generated when I dragged that element onto my form, I'm just changing the error message property. I'll save that and let's go back and look at our hello page again. And we get a pretty descriptive error. It says our required field validator needs to have the control to validate property set. What do you suppose that means in plain language? Why did I get this error? Yeah, we need to tell that validator which input it's supposed to be checking. So we've put a required field validator on, but we need to set one more property. I'll just wrap this to a new line so we can see it better. So I'll add a new property, and if I hit a space here, we can actually see the property we need. Control to validate. So what is the name of what's the ID of the input? So we want it to validate txt name. So this validator will check that the value of txt name is not blank. So I've now added this in blue. So we haven't written any C# code at all. We'll look at how this works in a minute. Save your page, go back and look at it again in your browser, refresh hello, and click your submit button without typing any text in the text box. What happens? Akash, what happens? Okay. We're going to have to configure one thing to get it to work. So yes, it's going to give us another error. This error is going to go away and we're about to get a different error. When I click. So here's what happens. So let me just go back and load the page again. So what happens is when we use these ASP.NET validators, the server writes the JavaScript validation for us. We don't have to write our own JavaScript. ASP.NET generates it, but it's using jQuery. And our problem is we just need basically to make a reference to jQuery in order to get this error to go away. There are a few ways of doing it. The simplest way to do this is we're going to add something. We can add a setting in our application that'll make this go away. So let's open up. We haven't used this before. We have this file down at the bottom, web.config. So open up this file. This is an application configuration file. So any global settings that apply to our whole project can be set here. So later on next week when we start working with a database, we'll put our database connection here. Later on today when we do 404 error handling and some other error handling, we'll set some of those things up in here because they apply everywhere within our site. So let me just think about where I want to do this. So in here, we have this section that says system.web. So I'm going to put in a couple of blank lines before the end. And I'll make a comment. So we need to enable the ASP.NET validators to inject their JavaScript for us. Whoops. Sorry, maybe this has to go after system.web. Just bear with me for a second. Got to make sure we put it in the right place. Yes. Sorry, this would go after our system.web section, not inside it. We'll come back to system.web later. So app settings also allows us to store any global variables. Like let's say we're going to let users upload files and we want to set a directory on the server as the default folder. So Jacob, after system.web. Add in that app settings tag. So in here, we're going to add a key called validation settings. So this is just an instruction to the .NET as to how to render the jQuery script that it's trying to write. We need this to add this setting to avoid the error we're getting right now. I know that key name is long and kind of hard to understand. There are some other ways to avoid this error. I've found through many long hours of trial and error, this is the simplest way to avoid it. If anyone happens to find another more elegant solution, I'm certainly open to hearing it. Once we've added that code in blue, if you go back and reload your hello page, we should hopefully be able to load that page now. And our required field validator should prevent our form from being submitted unless there's text in the text box. Try it again. Give me a little nod or wave if it's working. Yes, that fixes the code. So one of these validators can only validate one input control. If we have 10 inputs that are required, we need 10 required field validators. It can't validate all of them at the same time. So now if I go back, so notice we now have a space here. That's where the validator's showing up. We can get rid of that space in a minute. Or we can leave it there. So now when I click, if that valid text box is empty, my validator shows up. As soon as I type and tab out of the box, validator goes away.
Would there be a way to link that to add it to make the box better?
Absolutely. Let's do that. Now, we talked last week about the difference between the class attribute, the class property, and a CSS class property. Anybody remember the difference? They're similar, but they're not exactly the same.
CSS, ISP.
You got it. So what we want to use, thank you, Artem, is the CSS class attribute. We're already using Bootstrap, so we can use one of the alert classes in Bootstrap, like alert danger, which will be red. That was exactly what I wanted to do next anyway, Rob. So thank you for that. So now when I submit my form, right, it's red. So you can use your CSS to style it any way that you want. And we can customize whatever we want to display to the user. Maybe we don't have a lot of space, so we just want it to be a star that shows up beside the box. We can do that if we want to. In terms of what happens at runtime, so there's actual code running here, but we didn't write any code. All we did was drag this tag on. So how does it actually work if we didn't write any C# code? Well, if we look at the page source, ASP.NET automatically writes this JavaScript, and here is the JavaScript that checks. So here's our required field validator. There's all the JavaScript it writes to make sure the value of txt name on the client is completed. So it'll auto-generate these the JavaScript for us.
So that's just client-side.
Client-side JavaScript, by using the ASP.NET validator, it writes all the JavaScript rules for you.
Is there also a server-side check?
No. These are only client-side. These are performing client-side JavaScript checking. Now, you guys probably can't fully appreciate just how much work this saved because you're used to using HTML5 validation. HTML5 validation has really only been around for 5 or 6 years. It used to be that when you wrote forms for web applications, you had to write all of the JavaScript validation yourself, checking every field if it was filled out and checking all the rules. So on a typical, like a registration form like Facebook, to validate this, you'd probably write 50 lines of JavaScript to do all of this and do all the rules. So web developers spent a ton of time writing JavaScript for validation. And in 2002, when Microsoft launched ASP.NET, they actually came up with these validators right then. So I've basically had to write almost no JavaScript validation since then. But before then, we spent a lot of time doing this. So they've automated all of this, which is great. And yes, the HTML5 validators work really well. We can use them. So why would we use these? Well, there's two reasons to use a validator like this. One is we can style it with our CSS, right? When we use the required attribute of HTML5, we can't style it. We can't have it match the rest of our CSS. The other thing is when we add other kinds of validation, like checking that two values are the same, for example, again, we can style all the outputs the same. Now, if you want to use some combination of HTML5 validation and ASP.NET validation, no problem. Use whatever you like, whatever makes it easy, as long as it lets you add all of the validation rules that your page needs.
Well, you said it's using JavaScript. Let's say JavaScript is disabled, HTML5 validation still works, but ours not going to work in that case, right?
That is true. That is a limit of this, but realistically, any device that has JavaScript disabled may not do we can't be sure HTML5 is enabled on every device. So that's the flip side. There are still people that use devices or browsers or interfaces that don't support HTML5. We talked about that last term, right? If you only, when we did validation in PHP, we said it's a mistake to assume every user has HTML5. And also HTML5 validators, they're limited. Like you can't compare two, there's nothing to compare two values, for example, right? Or here on our tip calculator, for example, let's go here to tip. For example, in HTML5, how would you prevent this? This was just we're going to use HTML5 to validate that input. How would we do it? Yeah, we could say type equals number, so I can do that for a minute. So if I add on my amount text box, I say type equals, even though Visual Studio won't recognize it. So this should prevent me from typing ABC. Equals number from HTML5. Right? That's okay. But that isn't. The HTML5 number type doesn't accept decimals. It only accepts whole numbers. So here, HTML5 using the type equals number is not a good choice, right? It's going to block values that should be allowed. So our HTML5, that's just one example. HTML5 validators, they have some limits too.
Is it possible to check what kind of validation we have? Can we see the source of this JavaScript? Maybe we can change something.
You can't change it. That's the source. You can see it in the browser. So that's what it should field validator. So you may also say, well, this is too long, right? Using HTML5, it doesn't add all this JavaScript to my page, which is true. Thomas, you stretching or did you?
If you put a stat property and you put for an HTML5 validator, you can do that.
Okay. I would, all right, so.
Put stat equals any.
0.01?
I know like any like
Okay,
you can set that.
all right.
Try that.
Okay, that's a good solution. It works, sure. But there still may be other things, for example, we can't do, like particularly comparing fields. I don't know, for example, another thing I'm not sure we can do is make sure, I'm not sure if we can set minimums and maximums with this. We can. Okay, all right. So there's our required field validator. That's almost time for a break. Okay. Thanks for that. That's good. I like that. I hadn't used that before. The bottom line is chances are, I mean, what's probably best practice is use the HTML5 validators as much as you can because they add less JavaScript overhead and it's less coding for us. But where the HTML5 validators don't work, we also have the ASP.NET validators. And we'll look at some of the other validators after we take a break. So what we'll do, let's take a 10-minute break here. Please come back for 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, I want to show you assignment 1. I'm only going to explain it once. So if you take a 20-minute break and you come back at 10 after 9, you will have missed my explanation of the assignment. And I'm not going to repeat it. Okay, so please come back at 9. And we'll look at assignment 1, and then we'll look at the other validators. Let's take a break here.